Today's guest on the journey is a retired businessman who is working to dispel myths and misconceptions that surround diabetes. Now, we must note he is not a medical professional, but he has had the disease since 1981, which is over 40 years, and sees things from the perspective of people who have diabetes and experience the issues he discusses. And he then goes on to say the basic problem is that people generally do not understand diabetes and much of what they believe is untrue. I say no more, but we welcome Chet to the journey.
Well, hello, David. Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. Now, we spoke briefly before we started recording, and I always say this in interviews, so it's a clarification. Everyone has a journey, and your journey is about diabetes. We include the fact that we are not medical professionals. We're just giving our opinion and help people with awareness. So your focus is diabetes.
Right.
Can we talk about your diabetes journey today, please?
Sure. Back in 1981, I was 29 years old. I was in good health, very active, doing lots of things. And then one week, I got really, really sick. I never got sick, but this particular time I was out. I was on the sofa for 3 days, and then I got better. And I didn't think much of it because I was feeling better. But then a couple of months later, things started happening. For example, I was on a business trip one time. I went to visit a customer and I was very parched. I was very thirsty. So I went to a store and I bought some orange juice and I drank that to quench my thirst. And the condition got even worse. When I was in the meeting, I could barely talk. I was so dried up. Well, a few weeks after that, I went to a Blue Cross office and I was in the waiting room. And at random, I picked up a brochure they had about diabetes. And when I read the symptoms, I had every symptom except for the ones that applied to women. So I made an appointment with a doctor and he checked my blood sugar and he said, well, you've got diabetes. So life changed at that moment. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which means that you have to take insulin, which insulin needs to be taken by injection because if you take it orally, it breaks down in digestion. So from that moment on, I just committed to myself that I would be taking a shot at least once a day, every single day for the rest of my life, unless a cure was found. So that's been my story. I've been true to myself. I have never, ever missed taking insulin for even one day out of those 40 some odd years. And it sounds like it's really hard. And in a lot of ways, it is hard. It never goes away. You have to watch this thing every day, all day. But after a while, it just becomes part of your lifestyle. So you live with it. The reason I'm
Yeah.
trying to teach people about diabetes is that I've come to realize how much misinformation there is out there and how there's a stigma that is on people who have diabetes that is unfair and unfounded. The stigma has real consequences. When I was diagnosed, I was the president of a company. We were just getting started, required a lot of work. A lot of it was heavy work, and some of it was dangerous. So I didn't want people questioning my ability to do this stuff safely. So I kept it to myself, and I kept it that way for 30 years. I only told people who were very close to me or had a need to know. Well, the result of this was that several years ago, I talked to a former employee. I had known this guy for 30 or 40 years. He was a big, strong, tough guy, nice guy. But when I spoke to him, he explained to me that he had type 2 diabetes and didn't take care of it. So he finally couldn't take the pain any longer. He went to the hospital and they took one leg off on one day and the other one off on the next. So now he's in a wheelchair. A couple of years after I talked to him, he died. I went to his wake, and he had died of complications from diabetes. Now, the way that fits in with me is that I had kept it secret. He was one of those people who didn't have a need to know, so he never knew that I was diabetic. And I wonder what would have happened if he did know. Maybe 30 years ago, he would have come to me and said, Chet, I've got diabetes. What can you tell me about it? And maybe he would have taken care of it. So that's the kind of damage that happens here. Diabetics typically don't talk about their disease because people blame them for getting it. And they also feel free to criticize diabetics if they see them eating something that the critic thinks is wrong. This is something that happens around Christmas time, where you'll go to a party, and it's very possible that if you're eating a cookie, somebody will sidle up and say, do you think you really should be eating that? Well, diabetics can eat sweet things. You just have to do it within reason, and you've got to, take care of your higher blood sugar by going for a walk or doing something else that'll knock it back down. Sweets are not poison for diabetics, but a lot of people seem to think that's the case. So it's that sort of thing that I'm trying to dispel.
Yeah. And it is the fact that, like you said, it's about people's perception that it is bad for you. And like I said, I have read several papers that, they say it's about how you maintain diabetes is the key to being a healthy lifestyle.
That is exactly right. And maintaining it's really as much an art as a science. The reason it's an art is that it's a very individualized disease. In fact, with all the millions of diabetics that are out there across the world, it's been said that it's so complex that it's possible that no two cases are exactly alike. Because of that, you have individual characteristics that make your version of the disease treated differently than anybody else's. So you have to know your own body and understand what's going to raise your blood sugar and what's going to lower it. You have to anticipate whether you're going to be exercising heavily. If you are, you may want to run your blood sugar a little bit higher than you normally would, because exercise will drop the blood sugar. But that depends on your individual metabolism, how hard you work out, and other factors. So that's the kind of thing that diabetics have to be aware of. Now, there are two types of diabetes. I have type 1, which requires insulin, but type 2s don't. It's actually a different disease. They're called diabetes because they both result in high blood sugars, but the way they get there is totally different. And I'd like to explain what the difference is so people will understand what I'm talking about as we go on. Before I get into the type 1 and type 2, let me explain how the normal body operates. When you eat food, it gets digested into glucose. Glucose is a form of sugar. The glucose winds up in your bloodstream, and it gets carried to every cell in your body. Now, when your pancreas senses the glucose in the blood, it releases a hormone called insulin. Insulin acts like a key. It goes with the glucose in the blood, and it opens up each individual cell wall to allow that glucose in. When that happens, two things occur. One is that the glucose enters the cells where it's used for energy, and as it enters the cells, it's taken out of the bloodstream. So that process keeps your blood within a fairly narrow range. It goes up and down, but it's a narrow range. Now, that process is interrupted with both forms of diabetes. With type 1 diabetes, you wind up with an autoimmune disease that kills off the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas. So type 1s don't have the ability to produce insulin, and therefore the only way to treat it is by taking insulin. And that's where the injections come in. Type 1s have to take those injections right off the bat. There's no long-term progression toward it. Type 2 is a different disease. It starts with a condition called insulin resistance. We don't know why insulin resistance happens, so you can't prevent it. But once you have it, your blood sugar starts going up because your cells become resistant to insulin, which is exactly what the name says. over time, insulin resistance gets worse. So it takes more and more insulin to open up those cell walls. Eventually, your pancreas can no longer produce enough insulin to overcome the resistance. And when that happens, the glucose remains in the blood. And that's where the high blood sugar comes from. So they're two different diseases, but they both have high blood sugar. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The At any rate, the blood glucose winds up at an elevated level. Now, everybody has glucose in their blood when they eat. Diabetics have more of it, but why should that be a problem? Because your body does need the glucose. The problem is that when you have an excess amount of sugar in your blood, the blood literally gets sticky. Think about this. If you have a glass of water and you stir in a couple of tablespoons of sugar, what happens to it? It gets sticky. Well, the same thing happens to your bloodstream. When the blood gets sticky like that, it winds up adhering to your blood vessel walls, and it will cause cardiovascular disease. And that's a big, big problem with diabetes. There are other problems too. Your eyes can be affected, your kidneys, just about every part of your body gets affected by that high blood glucose. That's why diabetics who don't treat the disease wind up with terrible conditions that ultimately lead to death. Like Jerry, the guy that I talked about earlier, he wound up getting, his toes they lost blood flow and they died. And it went right up his leg to where they had to take his whole leg up. That's the result of high blood sugar. So this is nothing to fool around with. A lot of people seem to think that diabetes isn't that serious. Maybe it's because there are so many people who have it, or maybe because they have all these ads they see on TV where there are these happy dancing diabetics who have not a cure in the world. And, those ads are misleading. Even if you take the medication, you still have to watch your diet and you have to exercise. And, it's still no fun.
Mm.
But, the idea that you could just take a pill and everything would be okay is just plain false. And that's another fallacy that I'd like to talk about. One of the common things that people think is that you get diabetes because you're overweight. I know a lot of people who tell me that they try to keep their weight down because they don't want to get diabetes. Well, fat itself doesn't cause diabetes. What happens with, well, let me back off. What happens with fat is later on after you have the diabetic condition. If you look at the National Institutes for Health Statistics, they tell us that about 70% of us are overweight, but only about 15% of us have diabetes. That means there are 55% of us who are overweight but don't have diabetes. Yeah, when you look around you, if you talk to people about diabetes at all, you'll notice that there are a lot of overweight people who don't have it, and there are a lot of thin people who are in shape and watch what they eat who do have it. So what's going on there? The reason that's the case is that diabetes begins when a genetic predisposition encounters something in the environment that triggers it. That's why, weight is not a factor in the disease's initiation. Now, once you have diabetes, that's a different story. With type 2s, we know that fat does make insulin resistance worse. So it is good to lose weight to make that condition better. But it's a little more complicated than just losing fat. There are two kinds of fat. One is subcutaneous fat. That's the soft, squishy stuff that we think of as fat that's on the outside of your body and just under the skin. But there's another kind called visceral fat. Visceral fat is hard and it's packed internally around your organs. Visceral fat is what makes insulin resistance worse. So you want to lose the weight to get rid of that visceral fat. Luckily, when you lose weight, the visceral fat is the first to go. That's why even losing 5 to 7% of your body weight makes a difference. So the weight is not a carte blanche cause of diabetes. It's just a factor in maintaining your blood sugars. And there are other fallacies out there too. You know, people think diabetics are lazy or they're irresponsible because they ate too much sugar. One thing we know for sure is that eating sugar doesn't cause diabetes. It doesn't cause insulin resistance, and it doesn't cause the autoimmune disease in type 1. So, you know, society in general tends to blame diabetics for having it. In fact, there's one researcher who said that diabetes is one of the few diseases in America today where it's socially acceptable to blame the victim. Well, that's a crime because nobody asked for the genetics and nobody asked for the environmental triggers. And the fact is that we don't understand either one of them very well. So even if you wanted to avoid them, you couldn't. Now, talking about genetics, there was a University of Massachusetts study that was completed about a year ago where they identified over 200 genes that are connected with type 2 diabetes. So as we do the research, we are nailing down the genetic component of it. And it just reinforces the fact that diabetics don't bring this on themselves.
Yeah. And you're talking about genetics there. It's like people forget that people are constantly researching. You know, I've had people say to me about these researches, and I believe that the research will out because obviously it gets beyond the point of where you do have that initial, you got diabetes. It helps them understand.
Yeah, well, you know, people do need to understand, and that's a failure. The fact that so many people don't understand it is just a failure of the way diabetes has been presented over the years. If you Google diabetes causes, you know, it'll list weight in there with a whole bunch of other factors. But those things are presented as though insulin resistance doesn't exist. It's like everybody has insulin resistance, and therefore being overweight or eating too many carbohydrates is the cause of diabetes. It's not. It'll make your blood sugar rise to higher levels where diabetes is diagnosed, but they don't start it. I make a habit of talking to medical people about diabetes. My own doctor uh, agreed with me when I said, you know, this thing is just so complicated that with the 15 minutes you get to spend with people, you really don't have time to even to explain this, even if you wanted to. And he said, you're right, I can't. You know, that's why I hear people getting advice from a doctor, like, you know, the patient will say, well, what should I do now? And the doctor, in one case, said, well, stop eating bread. Well, great. Bread is a carbohydrate, and certainly eating a lot of it will raise your blood sugar, but it doesn't teach you the concept that all carbohydrates will raise your blood sugar. And part of what you need to do is identify the carbohydrates in your diet so that you can limit them. Um, that's the kind of thing that everybody ought to be taught, but they just aren't. A lot of people have type 2 and they don't even realize they have it because the symptoms are tolerable for years. Uh, Sometimes they don't know they've got it until they've had it for 8 years. Well, during that 8 year period, if you're eating a lot of carbohydrates, you're damaging your body during that whole time. It's a disease where as soon as you realize you've got insulin resistance, you need to take steps to control it. But here again, that's just information that people need that they're not getting. And that's
Yeah,
part of what I'm trying to do too. What I explained a few minutes ago about how normal bodies work and the reasons that uh, that type 1 and type 2 produce high blood sugars, that's background information that every diabetic ought to know. Matter of fact, I think every person, diabetic or not, ought to know it, just so that we understand, you know, that diabetics aren't responsible for the disease and give them some respect rather than criticism. Um, so there's a lot to this. Let me explain to you why I decided that there was such a big problem with misinformation about diabetes. I was in Chicago a number of years ago when Rod Santo was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. During that week, there were lots of stories about him in the papers and on TV. And it turned out that Santo had type 1 diabetes during the 1960s, kept it secret. And the reason he did it is that he was afraid the Cubs would fire him if they found out that he had diabetes. And he might have been right about that. You know, back in those days, there was a real, much more serious stigma than what there is today. Excuse me. Well, Santo was in a game one time. He was in the on deck circle. And I got to ask you this, David. I detect your accent. Do you know much about baseball?
I know a little bit.
Okay. Well, you know what the on deck circle is?
Um, well, you can clarify it, but
Well, here's the way it works. Well, you know what a baseball diamond is? It's
yeah,
like a square with
yeah,
bases on it. The on deck circle is a circle where the batter who's going to be coming up to the plate next is. He's there, and as soon as the batter at the plate either makes a hit or makes an out and gets off the plate, the guy in the on deck circle comes in, and then he's the next batter. Well, Santa was in the on deck circle. It's the last of the ninth, which is the last part of the ball game. His team was down by 2 runs, and there were 2 outs. Santo, and there were 2 men on base. Santo starts feeling the low blood sugar coming on. And this is a serious thing with type 1s, especially, and some type 2s who take certain medications. We can have low blood sugar. And that's a problem because your brain, unlike other tissues in the body, takes glucose directly from the bloodstream. It doesn't store it. So when your blood sugar is low, the brain no longer has the nourishment it needs, and things start going haywire. You can lose your coordination. You can start sweating. You can start seeing in double or triple. You know, a lot of things start happening. Luckily, it's easy to treat. All you have to do is eat some sugar. And when that blood sugar level comes back up, the brain comes back online and everything is fine. So Santo starts feeling that the symptoms of low blood sugar. Now, this is a problem for him because he's got 20,000 fans in the stands. And there's a good possibility if your blood sugar goes low enough that you could collapse. So there was a possibility he could have collapsed in front of all those fans. Well, he couldn't go back to the dugout and tell the manager he wanted a candy bar. So he just prayed that the guy at the plate would make it out and retire at the side. Well, instead, the guy walks. So now it's bases loaded. Santo walks up to the plate, and he said he looked up, and there were 3 pitchers, 3 scoreboards, 30 some odd people standing out in the field. When the pitcher threw the ball, it looked like it had a slinky attached to it. So he just took a wild cut at the ball, connected, and put it out of the park for a walk-off grand slam home run. He made it around the bases and back to the dugout in time to eat his candy bar, and nobody knew that story for 10 years. So, you know, with most people, they think, wow, what a dramatic thing. He hit this walk-off grand slam home run. What can be more exciting than that? Well, the average person would obviously think that. But a diabetic like myself knows that the real drama was what was going on in Santo's mind when all this was happening. You know, as I said, there was a good chance he could have passed out in front of the whole stadium.
yeah.
So I came home and I started telling that story. And that's when I realized how little people understand about diabetes. You know, I had to go through the whole explanation about what diabetes is just for them to understand the story. But after I got done telling the story, people would often ask me about type 2. And I didn't know much about that. What I discovered is that the things that I believed to be true about type 2 were wrong. And that's when I realized that if I've got it all wrong, then our whole society has it wrong. And sure enough, as I talked to more people, they all believed untrue things about type 2. So I was retired at the time, and I decided to make spreading the truth my retirement project. And I've been doing it for quite a while. What I've been doing, what the first thing was that I did was to write a book. It's called The Diabetes Book, What Everyone Should Know. And it explains diabetes in very understandable ways using stories and easy vocabulary. Once I wrote the book, I developed a diabetes education class that was geared really toward diabetics. And I mean, other courses are geared toward diabetics too, but it's more from a medical, technical perspective, where I'm coming from the perspective of a person who actually has this disease and has been dealing with it and dealing with other people about it for a long time. It's a different way of looking at it. So I taught the course for a few years. It was sponsored by the YMCA, the University of Massachusetts, Springfield College, various civic and church groups. So it was really getting out there. I had I gave the program at a medical clinic, as for example. This medical clinic was part of a major hospital here in Western Massachusetts. This hospital is as big as anything you'll find in Boston. I mean, it's a huge operation. Well, the director of the clinic liked what I was doing, so he got me a meeting with the head of medicine for the entire Bay State Medical Complex. I met with him, and he asked an endocrinologist to go see my program. It was a 3-week program, and the doctor came to each one of the weeks, and in the end, she really liked it. She wrote a glowing review to her boss, and I was going to be meeting with the entire endocrinology department at Bay State until, but I never did because COVID hit. When COVID hit, it was everything just blew up. I mean, the doctors were focused just on that. Nobody was having any kind of meetings together. So for 2 or 3 years, I just couldn't do this at all because you just couldn't do it. But during that time, I became aware of podcasts, and I realized that I can reach a whole lot more people by doing podcasts than I can by teaching, 10 or 20 people at a clip individually. So that's what I've been doing. That's why I'm coming to people like you to ask me, give me some airtime so I can explain this, because podcasters are all different. You guys all have slightly different niches. So your audiences are different. And not only can I reach more people, but I can reach a lot of different people depending on who the podcaster is. So I've been doing podcasts now for a year, and it's been working out pretty well. It's been fun, and people are interested.
And that is, excuse me, that is what I like about the key of podcasting because, like, my title is called The Journey because I believe everyone's got a journey. And the journey can be, and I use these words, muse, educate, inspire, observe, and understand.
Mhm.
So the key to podcasting as a rule, and with your story, I like we're talking about diabetes, and I'm not saying I'm a younger, broader market. I'm in the market to reach anyone because I believe everyone's got a story. Everyone has to hear a story. So you could be young, you could be old, you could be middle aged.
Yep.
And over the years I've been doing podcasts, and even before podcasts, when I used to be on the radio, I always believed the guest is priority. The guest tells their story. It's not about me, even though I'm there facilitating the interview and I'm interviewing you and I'm listening to you. It's your journey. It's not my journey.
Right.
And then if people do come to me and they tell me about your journey, yes, and yes, I'll talk about my journey. Or if I relate to the story, I will talk about it. Now, I relate to it in the fact that my late nan had diabetes, and I think she had type 1 or type 2. I forgot which one because it's so long ago, but she struggled. because for so long she was independent, she was showing that she could be strong. And when she got it with diabetes, she was like, "Am I supposed to cope?" And I said, "You can. You just got to be adaptable to what's around you now."
Right.
And so she was adaptable. She still cared for my late grandfather up to the point when he died, but she still had diabetes. She had heart issues, but she still carried on. So that's what the impetus of me originally joining the radio station in England was about, was because she said, do something different, help people, inspire people. And then when she died, I started my blog, and then that was helping people. And then only, like you said yourself, about COVID. COVID came along. I thought, I'm not doing much now. I wonder if we can reach more people about, reaching out and talking about their lives, because it beats the doom and gloom of what's happening in the world about COVID.
Right. You know, I like the term, the journey. We all do have different journeys. Now, my journey has been modified with the diabetes, but other people's lives are modified by many other things too. And it is just a question of how we cope. Life is really not a bowl of cherries. I mean, we have our good moments, we have our bad moments. Uh, but when you have adversity, you just have to figure out how to deal with it. You
Mm,
know, I mean, that's what I've done. I have never let diabetes stand in the way of doing something I wanted to do, and I like to do a lot of different things. Uh, like last fall, I had a chance to do falconing. Where they have the big bird of prey that'll come in and land on your arm,
yeah,
and then go off and find a mouse or something. I did that last fall. I skydived a couple of times. Um, Oh, I could go into a whole long list of things, but the point is that anybody who doesn't know about diabetes, and especially type 1 diabetes, might think that you are not able to do these things. Well, you can. You can work hard. You can play sports. I mean, there are guys playing football in the National Football League who have diabetes. Uh, it's just a question. It's just that you have to manage it. For everything you do, it's a higher level of difficulty because you're always concerned about the blood sugar and what impact this will have on your blood sugar. Other people don't have to worry about that, but that just means that you've got to be educated, you've got to understand your body, and you've got to do the right things. Now, that's something else, David, about diabetes. What it does is it just makes life, you have to live life with a greater degree of difficulty just because this is always on your mind. And instead of looking at diabetics as being weaker than other people, they ought to be respected for dealing with this and still carrying on with life as well as anybody else does. This idea of shaming is totally misplaced. In fact, this is kind of interesting, I think. When I was doing my classes, the best things that happened to me were at the end of the class when I would have a participant come up to me and tell me that the best thing I told them was that they didn't cause it because they believed that they caused their diabetes because they might be a little overweight. Well, maybe that's what brought it on. Uh, so diabetics often carry guilt and shame just because they don't understand the way the disease really starts. When people tell me this, you can see the guilt just fall off their faces. It's like, they smile and they just are relieved to know that they don't have to beat themselves up anymore. That kind of thing is so unnecessary and so unfair that it really needs to change. And again, that's why I'm out there. I'm trying to teach people these things.
so going forward, and obviously your teachings will carry on and you going on podcasts will help. But do you think people will understand those misconceptions, or do you think it will carry on being, and then this is not me sounding dumb in how I word this, Do you think that ignorance will still be fair?
I'm sorry, I
That
missed
people,
that last part.
basically, do you think people will still be ignorant and not understand the full concept of diabetes and just take it as face value? They won't understand truly.
Well, here's the thing. It is complicated and it does take time to explain, but I've created a couple of videos. Uh, they're both about 25 minutes long. The reason I did that is that if you have a 1 hour meeting, say your church group or your book club or your Rotary Club or just a group of friends, uh, it's shortened. They're short enough that you could watch it and then have another half hour for discussion. The two videos are called "The Confusing World of Diabetes," where I explain a lot of the things that you and I have already gone over, and then some. But it's really condensed, and I use graphics to make it simple to understand. I'm hoping that people will. Yeah, well, the other one is called "The Nuts and Bolts of Managing Diabetes," and it goes through how you can manage your diet and why exercise is important, the limitations of medications, and also kind of a boost to tell diabetics that, look, you take pride in what you're doing. Don't be ashamed of it. This isn't your fault. But my hope is that people will show this in groups. And as part of the video, I ask them to take what they've learned and tell somebody else, with the idea that if we do this on a big enough scale, that the word will get out there. What I found so far is that people really like to get the information. They're surprised, but they're happy to have it. And they do change their attitudes because they realize that what they thought about diabetics that's so negative was based on nothing. All it is basically word of mouth, where uh, somebody says, well, you're overweight, you're going to get diabetes. And somebody else repeats it and repeats it and repeats it. And next thing you know, it's common wisdom. Uh, but I think we can change things. I do. Uh, I also think it's a benefit to people who don't have diabetes, because when I explain about fat not directly causing diabetes, people get relieved because they walk around thinking, well, it's only a matter of time before I get it. Well, that's not necessarily true at all. As I mentioned earlier, only 15% of people have diabetes when 70% of us are overweight. So, you can take that worry away from people to a great degree. Of course, it's a double-edged sword. People think that if they're thin and in shape that they won't get diabetes, and that's not true either. Because if you got the genetic makeup and you hit the trigger, you're going to get it anyway.
Mm.
But it is information that people find interesting, and I think it's especially true because it's such a common disease. Just about everybody either has diabetes or knows somebody who does, like you, or you're worried about getting it. I mean, in some way, it impacts just about everybody, and I think that's why people find it interesting.
Yeah. So, if people would want to get hold of you and ask to talk to you, can they do that?
I'm sorry, David.
Basically, if people come to you and want to discuss this further, because obviously people might want questions after this interview's uploaded, can they reach out to you?
Yes, they can. They can go to my website. It's www.challengediabetes.us. It's not .com. People often make that mistake. So it's challengediabetes.us. The books and the videos are available there. They're reasonably priced because my goal is to get the word out. And there's also a contact us page there. And I encourage people that if they have any thoughts or criticisms or ideas, to please let me know, and I will get back to you.
Okay, and last question from me. What would you say to watchers, listeners, now to help them move forward?
I think you want to see your doctor at least once a year and most of us have a blood test once a year. just have your doctor check what's called the A1C. That tells you what your average blood sugar level has been. If your A1C is in the normal range, then you don't have to worry about the diabetes, at least for the moment. But as soon as it gets elevated, that's when you want to start treating for it. The way insulin resistance is diagnosed is by high blood sugar. So that A1C will show a slightly elevated high blood sugar. And when that happens, that's when it's time to really learn about the disease and cut your carbohydrate intake and do some physical activity and prevent your pancreas from losing its capacity to produce insulin. The earlier you start doing the right things, the better the chances are that you'll never get diabetic blood sugar levels. So that's what I would say. Just take care of yourself and keep an eye on it. Your doctor is probably doing that anyway, but it wouldn't hurt to ask.
Yeah. Chet, it's been amazing to talk to you today about your diabetes journey, not diabetic journey, but your journey with diabetes. I'm hoping your words will resonate with someone, will help them say, okay, and then understand it more, or pass this video or pass the audio file onto someone and say, listen to this.
Well, I appreciate that, David. And with the videos, like I said, they're cheap. They're $8.99. But if you show that to a group of 15 or 20 people, the cost per person is pretty cheap.
Exactly.
And that's my thinking. If you could go ahead and watch this with other people, you could really make a big difference.
And your website again, challengediabetes.us.
Right.
Thank you for sharing your journey today.
Okay. Thank you, David. I appreciate it.